Right. All right. Nagadzabeitsek i live stream. So. Ooh, yep. Again, Istige, here it is. Again. All right. Fade buenas. Todos hamzu bueno huzum ni umeega parume ekungok estigi un nuevo na episode Fanatsu. Fade. For those of you tuning in, this is another episode of Fanatsu. We are, what's it called? We are a month after Typhoon Mawar. People are still a fair amount of people are still without power. Some people still without water. Some people still without data. The struggle to recover, the struggle to rebuild continues on the island of Guam. Last week, our Fanatsu episode included a wonderful interview with three of the people who have been helping organize the Inafamaulig Mutual Aid Drive, Ginin San Lago. And so the work that those organizations out in the States do to send aid home, combined with the wonderful work that is being done here on the island, grassroots and governmental efforts to get things going again. Sidus Masi nu hamzu todos. Sidus Masi. As you can see, I have kept as my background the fallen statue of Kipua. And so this is kind of an iconic image coming out of the typhoon. Sometimes people lament sort of the loss of this iconic symbol. For me, who is very familiar with Kipua's history, I don't know. I hope that they replace this. I wish that they would replace the Kipua statue with Magalahi Harau, Magalahi Matopbang, or somebody else. But sort of we shall see. We shall see what they decide to do with that. But so Fanatsu for last episode and for the next few episodes will be focused on Typhoon Mawar, sort of the recovery and analysis of that. And so one thing that has kind of come up a lot, though, is how the changing nature of media, sort of how does this impact the way people experience the typhoon, the way people kind of expect sort of the recovery, the rebuilding to take place? How are governments held accountable sort of when media struggles without generators, struggles without staff to ask questions in a time when people need information, right? And so in the middle of all of these sort of discussions about sort of the recovery, people sort of uncertain about what's going on, the Guam Daily Post a few weeks ago published this and a series of other pieces about the government of Guam through the civil defense purchasing $60,000 worth of airtime on K-57. And so the rationale, according to the officials who did it, is that a lot of the island's radio stations were down after the storm. They weren't functioning. They didn't have diesel. They had damage, to their antennas, other types of damage. And so sort of the media, which had oftentimes been there to connect people after a storm takes place, right? When you can't watch TV, when you can't necessarily call each other on the phone, right? Usually there was at least some radio presence where you could call in, hear what's going on, get updated. And a lot of people expressed that was gone after Typhoon Mawar, that all of the radio stations, they were either inconsistent, they were absent, and there was days when there would be nothing on the dial. No matter where you turned it, there was absolutely nothing out there. And so the government of Guam sort of argued that they did this to kind of offer that space in a time when the private media landscape wasn't providing it. And they received criticism from people who had worked under previous governors, and including Senator Chris Barnett, who used to work a long time in Guam's media, but was very critical of this use of government funds to purchase radio time, right? That those who argued against this said, why would you do this? Just send out the releases, go and talk on the media, but don't buy the media. There was some references to this maybe being propaganda. To me at least, a lot of those seemed kind of overblown, some of the criticisms, but it definitely, for me, opened up an interesting thing, an interesting thing to consider, and that is Guam's media landscape has been changing for a while. It's always changing, but we've seen that sort of the common ways that we get media, newspapers, down to one regular daily printed newspaper, TV media, down to one now with just KUAM. And so even radio, which is still a audible force on the island, you find that a lot of radio stations are just kind of rooms in buildings, that an entire radio station is just like one booth and largely run by a computer. And so we see the shrinking. We also see the expanding in other ways of new media, smaller media coming to kind of carve out its own space. And so in thinking about this, I had to bring in somebody who, if you have been following Fanatsu for a while, then siempre esta en Hasu, esta en Tingo, esta en Tautau, si Dr. Manny Cruz, the founder of Fanatsu, or if you prefer, the godfather of Fanatsu, whichever sort of, do you want to compare him to George Washington, or do you want to compare him to Don Corleone? Whichever one keeps your Sakman afloat, I guess they say. And so Hafaday, Manny, I wanted you here to kind of talk about media in Guam before the storm, but after the storm. And also I'm excited because you're going to be talking about your new venture that you have been working on, Bracket News. And so Hafaday, Manny.
Hey, Hafaday. Yeah, so I'm always nervous before we do these things, no matter how many years it's been. But I guess, just to touch on the first point is media before the typhoon and after. I would say that this shrinkage, this decline that we're discussing today is obviously something that has been happening even prior to Typhoon Malor. But definitely, I don't even know if this exacerbates this decline that we're seeing, but it definitely highlights it. And it's even more apparent now than it ever has been. I have the unique vantage point, not as a scholar, but even before that, and those who have known me for a long time know that I was a journalist for quite a few years at the PDN and the Guam Daily Post. And so when we're talking about news media, I feel like I have an insider perspective on what that looks like before the typhoon. And now as an academic, what I'm seeing now with the students that I'm teaching in the communication and media program. And yeah, just in my conversations with other people in journalism. And so I would venture to say that all of this is kind of, this conversation kind of begins with like Gannett pulling out of, the Pacific Daily News, relinquishing its ownership to, now the Moylan Sonnet. But then after that, you lose the corporate funding that, held up the PDN for so long. And it's what really set them apart. They had a financial advantage over other news media. And once that dissipated, then a couple of years down the line, we obviously saw the PDN saying they were no longer going to have a print edition and shift to an exclusively digital platform, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But there is this vacuum, and what is going to fill it, we have yet to see. But as you already stated, we only now have one print newspaper. And yeah, and all the things that comes with, but yeah, after or even during the typhoon, you mentioned propaganda. I want to thank Senator Barnett for making that point. And I don't know actually if it is overblown, that criticism. I would venture to say that even prior to the typhoon, obviously a lot of media on Guam is propaganda for the military and the tourism industry, militarism, as some scholars point to it, But I was definitely one of the Guam residents who was very frustrated with the fact that the times that I did step into my car and I was able to turn on the radio, look searching for information, all I could hear was, "Oh, the government is doing so great. We're doing so great, Guam. Everything is good. Everything's going to be okay." And I was definitely not okay. I was sweating, masa halunzu, and no gas and all these things. And so, and then when it wasn't like, "Oh, we're doing so great," it was conversations with the former Rear Admiral Benjamin Nicholson talking about how the military is doing all of these things to protect its assets and all these things, and the whole like one Guam, propaganda spew, and that was it. And there was no information that was necessarily relevant to me. I wanted it to, I was trying to find alerts, available services, things like that, and it just wasn't there. And so, yeah, very frustrating.
Hunggan. Oh yeah, Hunggan. I think yeah, it is interesting. I mean, so let's actually unpack a little bit for people sort of the word propaganda, because I think sometimes people will use propaganda just to kind of refer to something that they don't like, right? Especially in kind of political speech, whatever the other side is saying is propaganda, right? But so then, but you mentioned propaganda even in terms of commercial interests, military interests, and so on. So let's actually just spend a little bit of time and then kind of think about something like that. So, how could we see propaganda in Guam's media landscape, for example?
There is no shortage of examples. And I've harped on about this, to my classes many times. I'm sure my students are very tired of me talking about, the intimacies between, the Guam news media landscape and the military. But, just, as one example, how many articles have we seen published where it's like, oh, the U.S. Navy sailors are here on Guam and they're here to clean up Agana Heights Elementary School, or they're going to paint X number of bus stops. So this is their service to the community. And when we're talking about propaganda, propaganda itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can have, there's social justice propaganda just as well as there is, alt-right propaganda. But the problem is when propaganda is being used to perpetuate, power and oppression. And, when we're talking about Guam, the Marianas, or even the Pacific, we're obviously going to be having a conversation about U.S. militarism, about colonization, and imperialism, and indigenous rights. On the other hand, these are all things that are thrown into the fray when we talk about propaganda here in Guam. And so, what is the function? What is the purpose of stories about U.S. Navy sailors painting a bus stop when there are so many other bus stops on Guam that are in disrepair? When the students who are going to public schools, the majority of them meet the criteria for free school lunches and all those things, like and all of that. Like, so there is a shifting of attention away from all of these other problems, these serious problems that we have, you know, and shifting that attention towards, oh, the great things that the military is doing and the purpose that the military serves here in Guam, which is to be a responsible partner in our community. And every man, woman in the military is an upstanding citizen. And look at all these great things that they're doing for our people. So,
No, thank you for that. Because I think in terms of Guam's media history in the 20th century, I think a lot of people don't recall or appreciate how kind of the media came in as sort of a colonizing force. That sort of, it was something, for example, that I mean, if you can see it if you kind of just read read the pre-World War II newspapers, right, is that it's media meant to cater to the small white American military or expatriate military on the expatriate white sort of community on the island. Eventually, some Chamorro voices do enter into it, but a lot of times it's those Chamorro voices who prop up sort of the authority of the Navy or authority of the United States. So like a good example that I always like to tell people about, Dr. Ann Perez Otori talks about him in her book, Colonial Disease. Dr. Ramon Manalisay Sablan, who wrote the Guam Hymn, was the first ever Chamorro medical doctor. And so he has columns in the Guam Recorder before the war, in which, his function is to basically tell Chamorros how they're dirty and they're backwards and they need to start listening to the US Navy. So give up your belief in the Tautomona, give up, your traditional medicine, and just start trusting the military with your health. And so even after the war, the military still functions in that way, or the media still functions that way, propping up American news as being more important, American voices as being more important. And so I think in some ways, Guam's media still kind of preserves that function, especially around, like you were saying, the military being sort of this force which exists to kind of support the troops, support the military function, and so on, make them kind of highlight them in certain ways. And so,
oh yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in reflection, and I know we you and I, we talked a little bit about some of the just like the reflections that we have about the typhoon, and just how important this was, in one regard, at a personal level. Like, I think for myself and probably for many other people, this was a confronting experience. Like, you know, this was Typhoon Mawar was definitely something like that I had not witnessed since Tong Sangwam and Paka and all that stuff. And it's very easy for us to become complacent and to forget about how serious these things can be. When for years we've seen weak ass typhoons and tropical disturbances. But like just thinking about what I experienced a month ago now, like what was I feeling? What was I thinking? Sitting in my hot ass house, sweating my ass off. I did not feel American. Waiting for, like 3 hours in line for gas, waking up at like 3 a.m. to like, oh, this gas station is open, go there. Like, that does not feel American to me. Like all of these things that we're told about ourselves, like we're, Guam USA, we are, we're American, stuff like that, modernity, modern life, all of the accoutrements that come with being an American, like, reliable cell phone service and air conditioning, stuff like that. All those things were kind of stripped away. And like the only thing that you were really left with is, the physical sensation of what you're experiencing right now. And for me, that was, like, blisters on my hands from, cutting down a fallen mango tree and stuff like that, or just sweating. That was the thing that was like really like overwhelming, like, and like not being able to escape that feeling of being just so uncomfortably and miserably hot. Like in those moments, that's for me when like I feel like I have the most clarity about who I am and my condition, when I'm removed from the propaganda that we're being fed and the noise and the clutter of life online.
No, again, no, thank you for your reflection on that. I think it's an important one, because it's like I am not somebody who believes that something like decolonization is time traveling or going back into the past, even though sometimes people feel polemically that it is. But there is something to be said sort of about how Guam has kind of adopted a way of life which doesn't quite mesh with where we live and how we live, right? I mean, even sort of thinking about how, we have developed houses which are ideal for air conditioning. But if there's no air conditioning, then these houses become sort of like saunas. They don't, there's just kind of yeah, it's good that they withstand the storm, but then there is also this feature that they're built to kind of withstand the storm. But if they don't have all these other things, then they don't function the way that they're supposed to. And so it's just an important reminder that it's not necessarily sort of against about going back in time or getting rid of everything, right? But there is a way that you can live in today's world which matches your island, your lifestyle, your culture, right? And so that's why, for example, next week we will have on Fanatsu Micronesian Climate Change Alliance to talk about things like energy democracy and sustainable alternatives for energy. Because one of the things that I saw, for example, is that people who had like solar panels, man, they were like the Kardashians all of a sudden. They were like charging all their stuff, washing their laundry. And it was funny too, because a lot of those people like went dark on social media, even though because they don't want people coming over and asking to charge and wash their clothes. But it was an important example that those who kind of live in an alternative way had possibilities, right? Everyone else is just kind of stuck in this system in which if it doesn't work, you're screwed. There's not much that you can do except to gifinomu, masahalam, zananga, sweat and wait. And so it has been a very eye-opening sort of experience in that way, especially because, you mentioned going through Pong Songhua in the past. I was 22 years old in Pong Songhua. And so like thinking then about going into through a typhoon in my 40s versus my 20s, versus then other super typhoons when I was 10 years old, definitely a lot of important sort of reflections to be had. Yeah, and so what if for somebody who is studying media, social media, also dabbles sometimes in sort of AI art and stuff like that. You were talking about sort of the physicality, right? That the storm and the recovery period brings you back into the world, right? And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, right? Because we live in such virtual, most of the world today lives in very virtual sort of electricity, internet data, sort of social media driven experiences. And so what can we learn then from the typhoon, which kind of forces a sort of pause or forces kind of a reality check?
What is to be learned? That is, I mean, that's a big question in a way, like, is there a lesson to be learned? But when I was talking about physicality the other day, and, just for those of us who were not there at that conversation, like, what I was talking about was just the presentness of like being Masahalum, being uncomfortable, being miserable, that feeling of just like, drowning in your own sweat. Um, like it was very sensory, like, and overwhelmingly so, but it was also very refreshing, very grounding. Um, and beyond that, for me, the lesson, was also in community. And of course, like, being present, being with yourself and being attentive to how you're feeling, and also the people around you and their needs. And beyond that, like, the importance of community. And I don't mean this in a way like where I'm trying not to sound like a neo hippie or something, or like, yeah, like I go to a wellness retreat every year, because I don't. But I mean, like, for me, my community, my people are, my mother's family. I'm lucky enough to live in a compound with a pretty traditional like kind of structure. Like my grandma is just two houses away. all of my uncles and aunties are pretty nearby. And one of the first things that, I did, obviously, after, it was safe enough to do so, was to go check on my grandma, check on my aunties and uncles who, you know, are diabetic, they go to dialysis, stuff like that. And so, and also, finding out what it is that the people around me need, like the mango tree I mentioned, or the avocado tree. Those are my grandma's trees that have been in our family for decades. And finding out, okay, we need to do this. We need to clear the walkway. People are safe. Let's figure out a plan to make things better. And so, like, that is the lesson for me, is just how important, um, or maybe it's more so a reminder of how important all of these things are, and not in like even a philosophical sense, but something very real and very tangible. Like, and as I mentioned to you, it was because of these things that, after my power came back on, like 2.5 weeks after the typhoon passed, like I just felt very like almost stunned in a way. And like, none of these things really feel like they matter. Like, oh, social media, like likes and posts, like all those things are very far away from like, what I'm interested, what I'm about. Like, I would much rather be spending my time with, people around me who like love and care for me. People who aren't trying to sell me things, they're not trying to like get anything from me, because there's way too much of that, in modern life. So that is the lesson for me. Now, a lesson for the larger community is, perhaps taking that idea, how do we expand that? And a lot of back to this, a lot of people in our community have already, on Instagram, they've been talking about, this is the importance of people coming together and having a strong, nurturing community. Finding out who amongst our people needs assistance, who does not have drinking water, um, who needs medicine, who needs supplies, how do we get that to them? And there's so many great activists in our community doing that work. So it was really nice to see. And in that regard, just to touch on that point too, the information that myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people, were receiving was largely from social media, from individual users, on Instagram, as opposed to the PDN or Guam Daily Post, stuff like that. And WhatsApp, we can't deny the importance and the reach of family WhatsApp groups when it comes to disaster recovery.
Again, that's a nice segue and transition there. Because yeah, so you have been studying Guam's media landscape for a while. You have worked in it as well. And so, do you see sort of some decentralizing going on? Do you see some sort of newer media taking over? Like, for example, what you were mentioning right there, like oftentimes you might receive sort of a press release or an update from the government via WhatsApp from a family member before, like long before you see it posted on the KOAM or the Post or the PDN and so on. And so are we seeing then sort of it shifting? Is this, for example, something that has driven like the rise and the popularity of something like Condit News, for example? What are your thoughts on that?
Even even 2 years ago, I would have been very apprehensive to call Candid News like a legitimate, news source. But you know, they are undeniably like, it is a force to be reckoned with. And in some ways, kind of the precursor to something like Bracket, or what will probably be to come after. Um, but yeah, I mean, like, I think Troy Torres, actually, he touched on it perfectly in the article you were referencing earlier. Like, back in the day, and I'm starting to, my age is showing now. I'm 34 this year, but like, he was talking about having journalists post up at the Joint Information Center, you know, and like I've done quite a few of those shifts as a journalist. Like, I remember spending all night in, is it not out of loop, but the governor's complex, up the hill, so like I've spent quite a few shifts there, doing my fair share of typhoon coverage. Um, and so I remember always being in constant communication with my editor, finding out what's the latest report from the weather service, what is the governor saying, stuff like that. And on the flip side now, as a consumer of news, like um, all of those things just seemed very absent this time around. And yeah, and as an academic and someone who is studying news media, we can point to a few things. There are a number of explanations. One is that over the past couple of decades, local newsrooms across not just the U.S. but globally, have seen um, diminished revenue, and due to and related to that, smaller staff sizes, fewer journalists, fewer editors. You then run into the issue of this thing called convergence, which is a phenomenon where, like, journalists are no longer expected to just write a story, but now they have to take their own photographs, they have to shoot their own video, they have to post all of this content up to the internet by a certain deadline. So many times journalists in local newsrooms are overworked, they're understaffed, under-resourced, and because of that, they just don't have the time, energy, or resources to do the types of investigative journalism that communities actually need. And so, there's more of a reliance on military press releases, for one, just to fill in that void, you know. And so, yeah, a lot of these things have to do with, like, the changing like business model of news media. And so, prior to this, and decades, or like for many decades, like, the model has been, you sell advertisements to advertisers and they pay for the publishing of your newspaper. Subscribers actually made a very few of that revenue. It was mostly because of ads. But now people are purchasing ads from Facebook and Google, and so that's less money going into to local newspapers. And so, yeah. And so, that's one of the reasons why Gannett, just pulled out of Guam. It just wasn't profitable for them, you know? And so, yeah. So those are some of, like, the underlying issues that, like, lead to what we're seeing today in the news landscape. KUAM, who is a multimedia platform, they are faring very well, in my opinion. And they were the best suited to outride, the changing landscape in news media. So, and we're seeing that with their responsiveness with publishing to social media, using infographics, using tech stories and all that stuff. They're doing really well, and I think they're probably going to fare the best, out of the local news companies.
No, yes. Yeah, it's good that you bring this up, because one of the things that I was yeah, one of the things that I was realizing is that even looking at the way the media is today, and looking at something, for example, like a lot of the stories now are simply sort of like one source, one item stories, right? Which means that it comes from one document, like, let's say, a court report or a criminal complaint or one social media post. And maybe there's like one comment on it, but then there's kind of like, there's sort of the idea of substantial investigative work, like really kind of digging into something. It just kind of doesn't seem to exist. And the problem, though, of course, is that those are the types of, because it's one thing just to kind of say that, oh, people are complaining on social media, right? Or this happened. but getting into the systems of life require more work. They require more dedication, right? And so thinking then that which of the news media can do that. But then also, as you were going earlier to when you were mentioning propaganda, is that news media that has particular financial interests or interests connected to things like the military buildup is very less likely to investigate the structures of our life, systemic issues, because it affects their bottom line, right? Is that at a certain point, powerful interests like to control media precisely for that reason. Is that you have sort of something which is putting out information to the public, and hopefully it can have a big, nice blind spot when it comes to you and your issues, right? So that's why I remember it was hysterical. KUAM for the longest time wouldn't ever say anything critical about the Calvo administration, or especially about like the governor himself, just because of like the financial interests in terms of who owned KUAM, right? And so I know that that's one of the dangers here, right? Is that media no longer has the ability to try to tackle anything larger than sort of just blip stories, right? Oh, this has popped up. We do something quick, put it out there, and then that's it.
Yeah, so you're talking about, again, the intimacies of like media and the military. And, just to paint a very like brief picture for our audience, like the PDN is owned by the Moylan's, wealthy family on Guam. KUAM owned by the Calvos, obviously. The Guam Daily Post is owned by Cortec, a construction company who, you know, I don't need to tell you guys about how obvious the connection is between contractors and the US military here on Guam. We've seen the deforestation, the overdevelopment, and all of those things. And yeah, I don't know, Sorensen Media too, like, rich white guy, now deceased. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of like when we're talking about ownership, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. And so, yeah, capitalism, military, and all of the attendant interests, in between. So I don't know. Many ways you can take this.
Yeah. I mean, so this then brings up sort of to the more decentralized sort of approach to media, the more grassroots focus, right? And this is why, for example, that something like Condit News is fueled by a smaller operation, and it has just sort of different costs, different interests, different investments. But what we see, for example, on like YouTube and on other platforms, and in particular fueled by places like Patreon, right, is like citizen journalists, people who can basically, be funded by people who watch their stuff or who support what they're doing. And then they can take on like a month-long project to produce a video about an issue, right? Or a week, tackle something for a week, and their bills are paid for by those who subscribe to them, support them, and watch them. And so I've wondered then if Guam can support that model. I mean, in some ways, Fanatsu is kind of connected to that model. So what are your thoughts on that, though? Because, of course, you hope to, you've launched and you're hoping to sustain something like that with Bracket News.
Yeah, that was a great segue, and much needed, because sometimes I ramble about nothing. So that is the model, that's the future, I think, of what journalism will be, because we talked about the shrinking of newsrooms across the US and in Guam especially as well. Like independent journalists, I should say, have shifted to more of a user focused model, and a subscriber based model where your audience actually pays, or there's fewer middlemen, and there's more direct access to the types of news that you want to be receiving as a user. So like people are paying and subscribing for the types of content that they want to see from journalists who are very passionate about the work that they're doing. And I can think of at least one or two independent journalists from Puerto Rico who, at least since 2015, have already begun this type of work and have rolled out this model of journalism. And in the U.S. too, we're seeing things like Puck, also an independent news outlet that has shifted to this model where your readers pay directly for their news rather than relying on advertisers. And also in line with that, like, a more horizontal type of hierarchy where like the money isn't just being funneled into some CEO's pocket, but like it's more equally dispersed among the people, among the journalists who are writing the stories. That is ultimately what how I see media on Guam shifting. And that's something that I'm hoping to kind of do with a bracket. Obviously right now it's just me. I kind of just started this on a whim. I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. And I was after attending a journalism conference back in April, and, just finding out about, having a better understanding of this model, this new structure that we're seeing, and the implications that it could have for Guam journalism. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me as a professor, at University of Guam, in communication and media, is the kind of the disinterest by students in local news. Like it never ceases to amaze me just how little news and information students in the program are actually consuming, and all the while they're enrolled in a journalism course, in a communication program. Very few of them actually read and attend to local news. And I think that that has a lot to do with this disengagement and this disconnect between establishment news and the actual community. And so what I hope to do with Bracket is report on the types of issues that people actually want to know about and what is useful and interesting to them. And kind of, yeah, all of this is very like far reaching, like, and there are different like nonprofits that there's a nonprofit model where like you have companies like Indigraph who invest in these like startup news companies, and to help it build that structure. But before we do any of that, like you have to establish that there is an interest in what you're trying to provide. And so that's kind of what Bracket is trying to gauge interest, and try to also just create a consistent habit for me. I like being creative in a way, and we kind of did that with Vanatsu and like creating things. And Bracket is another thing that I kind of enjoyed creating, and you see the AI art on there that I play around with, and all this is kind of very fun to me. And so it's a really cool exercise in that as well. But yeah, I'm hoping that this could be something much bigger than myself even.
No, c'est justement saying. So I have on the screen Bracket, the Patreon page, right? So many of you who watch Fanatsu regularly are familiar with Patreon because you hear me mention it all the time, just because it is the way that Fanatsu sustains itself and also supports others who produce for Fanatsu, right? So Fanatsu has a Patreon page that Manny started when he first began. Patreon was a lot newer then. And so it was kind of like Manny was like, let's do a Patreon. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but let's go ahead and do that. And so and it, over time, as you build an audience and as you create content and you connect to that audience, you can hopefully grow. Right. So As of today, Fanatsu receives money from those who subscribe to support it. And in exchange, 7 different people receive stipends every month for work that they do for Fanatsu. So for example, Yasugwanya Manny, Manny's wife, Helen, she produces the Aguut series, which is amplifying queer voices in Guahan. Senor Kin Conception does his Cuentos Guahan podcasts, mini Dikikina podcasts, small Chamorro language podcasts, 2 every month, sometimes 3, and Mansueti hit if we're lucky. And so all sorts of stuff like that. And Patreon provides the easy foundation where somebody who wants to create something can hopefully build an audience who are willing to help support, make that possible. And so for Manny's venture here, I mean, if you have the means and the ability to support, I've put the link to the Patreon page into the comments for the live stream. You know, put favor, if you're able to join, please do. For me personally, I support every Chamorro or Guam project that I can find on Patreon. Whether I can give $1, whether I can give $5, just because, you know, that's Tsensuli, right? That if you want to see Chamorro things in the world, then find a way to support Chamorro people who are creating things. And Gentihita pues Hadzi, if we don't support Chamorros who are doing the work, then who else is supposed to support Chamorros who do the work? FEMA? Don't rely on FEMA for that. Oh my goodness, you'll be waiting for eternity for your boxed water to arrive. And who knows what'll happen after you eat all the MREs. And so again, put favor, if you have any questions, we've got a few comments and a few questions that have come in so far. But I do want to ask you, Manny, why the name Bracket for this media and news analysis with a critical Indigenous spin? Why the name Bracket?
Oh, yeah. You know, so Bracket, I was thinking, you know, just along the lines of like, you know, what it is that I do and what it is that I'm trying to provide. And, you know, thinking of my role as an educator, you know, in journalism, I often leave editorial notes for my students. Oh, yeah. I leave editorial notes for my students, and oftentimes, I'm always like, this would go better here, and maybe make this the 3rd paragraph down. This doesn't seem as important. Like, those are all things that happen within the brackets, and in that bracket, there's a subtext, and there is, all sorts of things that happen. There's a lot of things that happen between the brackets. A lot of it is very educational. A lot of it is, yeah, just so many things. But really, my intent was to provide people with, kind of educate people while also providing sort of counter narrative and, reading between the lines in a way, but of like, establishment media news.
Ooh, Zahua, no. I like that. Another metaphor to talk about liminality or the ambiguity sort of our position, Biba. And so we have a comment here. Noah Lee says, awesome. We need more voices calling out the empire. Corazon emoji and Bumendidi Tunakanaine emoji. And so Sidus Masi Noah for tuning in. Jay Baza Pasqua, who used to be a journalist on Guam, worked for KUAM. He says, I grew up with the local news industry, then I grew up with local news and then was in the industry, and the landscape has changed dramatically. Sidus Masi J. And then we have, Sibabi Benevente, who has commented and says that Mawar is the 20th typhoon that she has experienced in her lifetime. And she has observed the differences in how we respond as a community and how families respond as well. She shares a story that she saw a few days after the typhoon, young boys kind of playing basketball, when there was still plenty to clean up in the village. And she wondered kind of, is there a shift? What is the change that's going on sort of in our community? And so we have another question from Noah here. Sidus Masi, he says, what is your opinion on our current local mainstream news media and how it serves or fails the people?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Noah. Thank you. Current opinion on local mainstream news media and how it serves or fails the people. Um, I think like establishment news media is at its best when it is serving like a practical function for the people, and that is providing people with timely and relevant information. And in the context of the typhoon, like getting us those joint information updates, as soon as possible, letting us know, where which stores have drinking water, which ones don't, when can I expect, GPA to reconnect power to my line, things like that. I think where it fails the people, and we're talking about this disconnect, is when it's is being used to conceal the nature of the type of oppression that we're experiencing, and when it's being used to further propagandize us into accepting, um, you know, manufacturing consent over the conditions that we're forced into. And so, like, I'm trying to find good things to say about news media. There are some positive examples, perhaps, with like KUAM's Culture Club. But then again, in a way, like, that also showcases, like, just to what extent Chamorro-ness and indigeneity is allowed within the mainstream. In a way, you know, it's only allowed to exist in the realm of culture and things that aren't necessarily uh, subversive or threatening to the dominant structure. And again, U.S. militarization, imperialism, colonization, things like that. So, like, on one hand, it's very frustrating to me. On the other hand, it's very cool seeing people in our community on TV, right? So, but like, again, I think it fails the people when it's being used to um, kind of blind us from our condition.
Sidus Masi, Noah and Manny. I think, yeah, media has, like so many things, as I mentioned before, it has that colonial legacy of how it comes into Guam. So for the longest time, media had that explicitly Americanizing purpose in Guam, right? It was here to support American interests, to kind of, right, prop up America. And sort of, it was interesting then, because when you look at sort of how media shifts over time, if you look at newspapers, for example, in the 1950s, or even radio in the 1950s, right? You had the Rosary Hour on KUAM. You had like the Chamorro Hour, but the Chamorro Hour was often just a Chamorro DJ playing American country western songs, because that was the idea that that's what Chamorros like to listen to at that time. But if you look in the newspaper in the 50s, the Guam Daily News, for example, there was always a little bit of local politics that appeared on the front, a bunch of stateside news, some international news, and then the only places sort of that Chamorros might appear is if, for a while, if they're going to college in the States, there might be a mention of them going off island or they're graduating. But what happens is military service, leaving for the military. And then in the 1960s, that really becomes pronounced once there's Vietnam, where kind of they even put pictures of people who are leaving to go into basic training. And then, of course, later, then they start to put the pictures and information about those who are killed in Vietnam. And so definitely the sort of the way that the media frames it, right, is crucial. Like what you were saying, Culture Club is cool, but it's also very tokenistic in some ways, right? Just like when the PDN said, oh, no, we like Chamorro stuff. And then they allowed the Juan Malamunga to exist like in one corner of the Pacific Daily News, while kind of maintaining the same structure as before. And so I think what Manny is talking about there is key, right? Is that inclusion does not necessarily change sort of the system that you're being included in. There are some systems which are predicated on excluding, but many systems can simply absorb what they previously excluded and then claim that it is part of their benevolence and sort of it is part of their power that they are allowing this to now exist. And so media is key sort of in that. And so we do actually have I think we actually have a journalist from Hawaii watching, Rod Perez. He used to work for the PDN back in the day, and I know he's been doing some stuff with ProPublica. He's tuning in now. And so, Manny, we're almost out of time. So I wanted to give you a chance to share any final thoughts that you might have. You know, we've pitched Bracket, and so remember that this is, in some ways, this more community-driven model is closer to kind of Chamorro culture. It's closer to the community sort of minded ways in which we exist. And so I hope more people will buy into this, right? Instead of kind of throwing your money behind sort of these larger corporations, which are interested in just kind of maintaining themselves. Like that more people support this kind of community-driven model, right? Which is that you participate in the media making possible and that you help set the agenda in terms of what the media covers and so on. And so what are your final thoughts?
I think we've covered a lot, but I do want to say Sizos Masi to having me on Fanatsu. It's always great being able to just dialogue with you and share all these ideas, and it's also very grounding for me. But yeah, like as Maget is mentioning, with Bracket, it's $8 a month, and it's the type of content that I'm hoping people will find relevant to them, while also beginning a process with each story of unpacking and undoing the decades of propaganda that we had shoved down our throats with establishment media. It's also something that I hope will grow and flourish into something that is much larger, that doesn't have my face on it one day. And so yeah, I can only do that with the support of our community and with viewers like you. So yeah, I just want to thank you all for your time once again.
Sidzus Masi, Manny, and don't forget Bracket News. Go to patreon.com/bracket841, and that is the link if you want to sign up and support. And remember that the more you support Manny, the more he is able to produce, right? So that's the way it works, is that Fanatsu used to be kind of a small group of people who kind of put out like a weekly podcast, and then eventually it grew because of the support of so many to include all sorts of other things, right? And so with Fanatsu, we digitized Chamorro music and upload it to YouTube. We've even started making Chamorro language videos, right? So all of this is made possible because of the support of the community. And so for Manny, somebody who has written in a scholarly sense about the island's media, somebody who has lived and worked in the island's media, somebody who, because of his ties to the island, just cares about the type of media that our island has. It's good to see you taking on sort of another way of speaking to people about these critical issues. And so, Sidzus Masi, Manny, por ifinatot mo para este episode. Sa Sidzus Masi no hamzu lokwe ni umeega parume ekong para este finakpo este episode Fanatsu. Adios, este kimana lihital.